March 19, 2009. Firemen burst through the door of a Paris apartment to find a 70-year-old man collapsed on the floor, unresponsive. But this wasn't just any elderly man, this was Serge Nubret, one of bodybuilding's most legendary figures. A man who weeks earlier had been training with the intensity of someone half his age. Within hours of his hospitalization, something strange started happening. Whispers began spreading across bodybuilding forums worldwide. The official story from his family seemed straightforward enough. A pancreas issue, nothing suspicious. But then other voices started speaking up. Friends who claimed they knew what really happened. And what they said would turn this medical emergency into one of bodybuilding's darkest unsolved mysteries. The man lying in that hospital bed was no ordinary athlete. Serge Nubret wasn't just a bodybuilder. He was a phenomenon. Born in 1938 on the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, young Serge grew up in a world far removed from the glittering stages of bodybuilding competitions. When his family moved to France seeking better opportunities, the 12-year-old discovered something that would change his life forever. He found weights. More importantly, he found purpose. By age 19, he'd already won his first title, Mr. Guadeloupe. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Serge would carve out a reputation as one of the most aesthetically perfect bodybuilders ever to step on stage. They called him the Black Panther, and it wasn't hard to see why. Where other bodybuilders of his era were building mass at any cost, Serge moved with a predatory grace, every muscle defined and proportioned like a sculpture come to life. His trophy case told the story of a champion. NABBA Mr. Universe in 1976, Mr. World the following year. Multiple world championship titles spanning from 1960 to 1983. For 23 years, he competed at the highest levels, accumulating wins that most bodybuilders could only dream of. But there was one title that always seemed just out of reach, Mr. Olympia. And the story of why he never claimed that crown would eventually play a role in the controversy that ended his life. The year was 1975, and bodybuilding was about to have its breakout moment. A documentary crew was following Arnold Schwarzenegger and other top competitors as they prepared for the Mr. Olympia contest. The film would eventually become Pumping Iron, the movie that brought bodybuilding into mainstream consciousness. But behind the cameras, political games were being played that would haunt Serge for decades. The 1975 Mr. Olympia wasn't held in Los Angeles or New York. It was staged in Pretoria, South Africa during the height of apartheid. The country was banned from the Olympics and the World Cup, desperate to improve its international image through sports. And the IFBB, bodybuilding's governing body run by Ben and Joe Weider, took the money and the opportunity. Here's where the story gets complicated. Serge Nubret, a black bodybuilder from Guadeloupe, had actually supported South Africa's membership in the IFBB under specific conditions. The most important being that the next president of the South African Bodybuilding Federation had to be black. The Weiders downplayed these conditions and admitted the country anyway. When Serge arrived in South Africa, he was hit with devastating news. He was temporarily banned from competing. No clear reason was given, but the timing was suspicious. Serge was in peak condition, better than he'd ever looked, and he represented a real threat to Arnold's 6th consecutive title. Eventually the ban was lifted, but the damage was done. When the Pumping Iron documentary was released 2 years later, it portrayed Serge as nothing more than a last-minute entry, barely worth mentioning. The film focused on Arnold's rivalry with Lou Ferrigno, relegating Serge to background footage. But those who were there knew the truth. Serge finished second to Arnold in the heavyweight category. Some believed his conditioning was good enough to win if the political games hadn't interfered. The final decision came down to just a few points. Arnold won his 6th Olympia, retired on top, and rode the wave of Pumping Iron's success straight into Hollywood stardom. Serge watched as the Weiders elevated Arnold, while minimizing his own contributions to the sport. The bitterness ran deep, so deep that Serge eventually founded his own federation, NABBA, to compete with the IFBB. The rift between Serge and bodybuilding's power brokers would never fully heal. But what made Serge truly unique wasn't his trophy count or his political battles. It was how he built his legendary physique. In an era when bodybuilders were pushing maximum weight for low reps, Serge was doing the exact opposite. His training philosophy seemed almost insane by conventional standards. 40 to 50 sets per body part, not 5 or 10, 40 to 50. Each set contained 12 to 20 reps, and here's the part that really confused people. He only rested 30 seconds between sets. To put this in perspective, Serge could bench press 225 kilograms when going for maximum strength. But in his regular training, he'd use only 70 to 100 kilograms. Lightweight, massive volume, no rest. He called it pump training. The goal wasn't to lift the heaviest weight possible, it was to force blood into the muscle and keep it there for as long as possible. Every single morning, regardless of how he felt, Serge would start his day with 2,000 sit-ups, not 200, 2,000. Then he'd hit the gym for workouts that could last several hours, moving from exercise to exercise with barely enough rest to catch his breath. The diet was equally unconventional. While other bodybuilders were eating 6 to 8 small meals spread throughout the day, Serge ate 2 or 3 massive meals, and the cornerstone of his nutrition, horse meat. 4 to 6 pounds of it every single day, along with rice and beans. Horse meat was leaner than beef, packed with iron and protein. Serge consumed somewhere between 400 to 600 grams of protein daily. He didn't believe in traditional cutting or dieting. No cardio sessions to lean out for competitions. Just that extreme training volume and mountains of meat. His philosophy was simple but radical. There's no such thing as overtraining, he'd tell young bodybuilders. Only undereating and undersleeping. Keep training even when you're sore, even when you're tired. The body would adapt if you fed it enough and rested enough. Critics said it was impossible to build a champion physique this way without pharmaceutical assistance. Serge claimed he was natural. Whether you believed him or not, the results were undeniable. His physique became the gold standard for aesthetic development. As Serge moved into his 60s, most athletes would be thinking about retirement, maybe some light training to stay healthy. Not Serge. At age 65 in 2003, he was still competing at world championships in France, showing off a physique that would be impressive on a man half his age. But that year brought his first serious health setback. He suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and affected his speech. For most people, this would be the end of athletic pursuits. Serge saw it as merely an obstacle to overcome. He adapted his training, worked around his limitations, and refused to let his condition define him. By 2009, at 70 years old, word was spreading through the bodybuilding community that Serge was preparing for a comeback of sorts. Not to compete, but to make a guest posing appearance at that year's Mr. Olympia. Those who saw him during this period were astonished. He reportedly weighed the same as he had during his competitive prime decades earlier. His physique still carried that same dangerous elegance that had earned him the Black Panther nickname. The muscle definition was there. The symmetry was intact. Friends and fellow bodybuilders couldn't believe what they were seeing. This man in his 70s looked better than most people in their 30s. He was still following his extreme training protocol, still eating massive amounts of protein, still doing those 2,000 morning sit-ups. Everything about Serge Nubret suggested a man who would be training and inspiring people for years to come. Then came March 19, 2009. The day started like any other, or at least it seemed that way. But by the end of it, Serge would be fighting for his life, and a mystery would begin that bodybuilding fans are still debating more than a decade later. What exactly happened that day? The answers depend on who you ask, and the truth might be darker than anyone wants to admit. When those firemen carried Serge Nubret out of that apartment on March 9, 2009, he was unconscious and unresponsive. The ambulance rushed him to La Reboisière Hospital in Paris, one of the city's major medical centers. Within days, his family posted an official statement on his website. The message was clear and seemed to close any questions before they could even be asked. Their father had been found at home in a coma. He was transferred to the hospital and placed under medical supervision. The diagnosis was a hypoglycemic coma, probably due to a malfunction of the pancreas. They emphasized that explorations were continuing while Serge underwent rehabilitation. Nothing in that statement suggested anything suspicious. Medical emergencies happen, even to the healthiest looking people. Pancreatic issues can be unpredictable and dangerous. On the surface, it seemed straightforward enough, but there were details that didn't quite add up for those paying close attention. Serge had no history of pancreatic problems. He'd been training intensely right up until his hospitalization. For a man supposedly suffering from organ malfunction, he'd shown zero warning signs in the weeks leading up to his collapse. Then there were the test results. Brain MRI? Completely normal. Heart MRI? Also normal. No evidence of heart attack. No evidence of stroke. For someone found unconscious and unable to wake up, the medical imaging painted a picture of a remarkably healthy 70-year-old man. If his organs were failing, why weren't the tests showing it? The official story started to feel incomplete. And that's when the other voices began speaking up. About a month after Serge was hospitalized, posts started appearing on bodybuilding forums. The first came from someone on a website discussing alternative healing methods. The poster claimed to be a friend, and had a very different story to tell. Serge hadn't just fallen into a coma from natural causes. He'd been poisoned. Deliberately. According to this account, Serge wasn't found at his own home at all. He was found at his daughter Pascale's apartment. When he arrived at the hospital, he wasn't taken to a regular ward. He was taken to the intensive care toxicology department. The toxicology department. That's where they treat people who've been exposed to poisons, drugs, overdoses. Why would someone with a pancreatic malfunction need toxicology care? The poster claimed that Serge had been in excellent health before whatever happened to him. His physique looked similar to his prime. His weight was the same as it had been decades earlier. There was no reason for a sudden medical collapse. But there he was, hospitalized, unable to recognize people, unable to speak or move properly. The poster pleaded for people to send positive energy and prayers. Then came a detail that made everything even more disturbing. A police investigation had allegedly been launched. Police District 10 wasn't giving out much information because of protocol and security precautions. But according to this account, some of Serge's family members were under investigation. The story spread like wildfire through the bodybuilding community. More posts appeared on other forums, supposedly from friends close to the situation. They painted an increasingly sinister picture. Serge wasn't just unable to recognize people, he'd been heavily sedated, kept in what one poster described as a drugged-up, hypnotic zombie state. He'd lost significant weight in just a few weeks. One of the most alarming details, his daughter Corinne, who happened to be an anesthetist, was reportedly put in charge of his medical care. An anesthetist specializes in sedation and drugs that render people unconscious. No one outside the immediate family was being allowed to see Serge. Friends who tried to visit were turned away. The claims grew darker. When police finally got involved and the heavy sedation was reduced, Serge's condition allegedly improved dramatically within 24 hours. He started recognizing people again. He began showing signs of awareness. It was as if he'd been deliberately kept in a fog, and when that fog lifted even briefly, the real Serge started emerging. His family never directly addressed the specific allegations beyond their initial statement. They maintained that Serge had suffered a medical emergency related to his pancreas, but they never explained why he was in the toxicology department. They never explained why his brain and heart scans were normal despite his comatose state. They never explained why police had allegedly gotten involved. The silence on these details only fueled more speculation. Some defended the family, arguing that unverified claims weren't evidence of anything. Medical emergencies can be complex. Just because the initial scans came back normal doesn't mean nothing was wrong. Pancreatic issues can be difficult to diagnose immediately, but others couldn't let it go. Here was a man in seemingly perfect health, training like a champion, looking decades younger than his age. Then suddenly he's in a toxicology unit, unable to function, allegedly improving only when police intervention reduced his sedation. The circumstances were too strange to dismiss, and hovering over everything was one unavoidable fact. Serge Nubret had wealth, property, intellectual property from his books and autobiography, and a legacy worth significant money. When elderly people with assets suddenly fall ill under questionable circumstances, with family members controlling their care, suspicion isn't unreasonable. It's basic human nature to question. The bodybuilding community remained bitterly divided. Some believed the family's version, others were convinced something far darker had occurred. But everyone agreed on one thing. They wanted answers, real answers, verifiable facts, and those answers never came. For 2 years, Serge Nubret remained in that limbo state. 2 full years of hospitalization. Not days or weeks, but 730 days of Serge lying in a hospital bed, his once powerful body gradually wasting away. The man who had spent decades sculpting himself into one of the most perfect physical specimens in bodybuilding history was now trapped in a shell, unable to communicate, unable to move, unable to explain what had happened to him. Throughout those 2 years, the bodybuilding community continued following whatever scraps of information emerged. There were occasional updates, usually vague, never providing the clarity people desperately wanted. The controversy never truly died down. Every few months, someone would revive the discussion on forums. New people would discover the story and dive into the mystery, trying to piece together what really happened from contradictory accounts and unverified claims. Some pointed to the fact that Serge's condition never improved as evidence that it was a legitimate medical issue. If he'd been deliberately harmed, wouldn't authorities have intervened? Wouldn't there have been arrests? The absence of any criminal charges suggested maybe the whole poisoning theory was just internet conspiracy thinking run wild. Others argued the opposite. The lack of criminal charges proved nothing except that covering up such things is possible when family members control access and medical decisions. Without an independent investigation, without Serge being able to speak for himself, the truth had been buried along with him in that hospital room. One thing that particularly troubled people was the absence of any autopsy results made public after Serge eventually passed away. When someone dies under controversial circumstances, especially when there have been allegations of foul play, an autopsy can provide answers. Was one performed? If so, what did it show? The silence was deafening. Serge's family did release one more statement addressing the rumors, essentially repeating their position that the poisoning allegations were false, but they never provided detailed medical records that might have settled the controversy. They never allowed independent doctors to examine the case publicly. They never addressed the specific claims about the toxicology department, the police investigation, or why Serge allegedly improved when sedation was reduced. In fairness to the family, medical privacy laws exist for good reasons. They weren't obligated to share every detail of Serge's condition with the public. But the lack of transparency, combined with the strange circumstances and unverified but persistent claims, meant the cloud of suspicion never lifted. Some of Serge's friends and fellow bodybuilders spoke up over those 2 years, expressing their belief that something wasn't right. Others remained silent, perhaps out of respect for the family, perhaps because they genuinely didn't know what to believe. The truth is, very few people had actual first-hand knowledge of what happened. Everyone else was working from second-hand accounts, forum posts, and speculation. The divisions within the bodybuilding community reflected a larger truth about cases like this. When someone can't speak for themselves, when the facts are murky, and when different parties have different incentives to tell different stories, the truth becomes almost impossible to pin down. And that's exactly where everyone remained when April 19, 2011 arrived. On that day, 2 years and 1 month after he was found unconscious, Serge Nubret was declared dead. He was 72 years old. The Black Panther was gone. The official announcement came from his children, posted on his website. It was brief and formal. They were sad to inform everyone of their father's passing. The funeral would be held on April 29 at Père-Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, one of the world's most famous burial grounds where countless legendary figures have been laid to rest. People could leave messages of condolence for the family through a provided link. That was it. No explanation of what ultimately caused his death after 2 years in a coma. No final medical report shared with the public. No resolution to the questions that had been hanging over this tragedy for 2 years. The bodybuilding world mourned, but the mourning was complicated. Everyone agreed that a legend had been lost. Serge Nubret had achieved things in the sport that few could match. His physique represented an ideal that transcended his era. His training methods, however unconventional, had produced undeniable results. His contribution to bodybuilding's golden age was immeasurable. But beneath the tributes and the fond memories, the darker questions remained. What really happened on March 19, 2009? Why was a man in apparently excellent health suddenly found unconscious at age 70? If it was a pancreatic issue as the family claimed, why were his brain and heart scans normal? Why was he reportedly in the toxicology department? Why did friends claim police were investigating family members? And perhaps most haunting of all, was that broken, desperate forum post actually written by Serge Nubret himself? The funeral took place 10 days after his death. Those who attended paid their respects to a man who had given everything to the sport of bodybuilding. But even as they stood around his grave, the unresolved controversy hung in the air like smoke. To this day, more than a decade after his passing, you can still find discussions about Serge Nubret's death on bodybuilding forums and websites. New generations of fans discover his story, marvel at his physique in old photos and footage, then inevitably stumble onto the dark mystery surrounding his final years. Some conclude it was exactly what his family said. A tragic medical emergency with no sinister cause. The internet rumors were just that, rumors, amplified by people with too much time and not enough facts. Others remain convinced that Serge was the victim of something far more deliberate. They point to the strange details, the contradictory information, the timing of his decline right when he was still looking phenomenal, and potentially controlling valuable assets. The reality is, we may never know the truth. The people who know what really happened, if there is anything beyond the official story to know, aren't talking. Medical records remain private. No autopsy findings have been made public. No criminal investigation resulted in charges. The case is closed in every official sense. But in the court of public opinion, among bodybuilding fans and true crime enthusiasts who followed this story, nothing is settled. Serge Nubret's legacy is now inextricably linked with this mystery. When people discuss his achievements, his incredible physique, his unique training methods, the conversation almost always turns to how it ended. The controversy has become part of his story, whether fair or not. What makes this even more tragic is how it overshadows what should be remembered about Serge. He was a pioneer who proved you didn't need to lift maximally heavy to build an incredible physique. He competed at the highest levels for over 2 decades across multiple federations. He helped expand bodybuilding internationally and founded his own federation when he disagreed with how the sport was being run. He appeared in films, wrote books, inspired countless people to pursue physical excellence. His aesthetic approach influenced generations of bodybuilders who followed. In a sport increasingly dominated by mass monsters, Serge represented the idea that proportion, symmetry, and elegance mattered just as much as sheer size. But now, when his name comes up, there's always that uncomfortable pause before someone asks the question, what really happened to him? And the honest answer is nobody knows for certain. The official explanation is a medical emergency. The alternative theory is something far darker involving family and financial motives. The evidence supporting either version is incomplete. What we're left with is a cautionary tale about how even legends can have endings shrouded in mystery and controversy. We're left wondering what Serge would say if he could tell his own story. We're left with forum posts that may or may not be authentic, with claims that were never verified, with questions that were never answered. The Black Panther spent his life building himself into something extraordinary, defying conventional wisdom about training, pushing boundaries, creating art with his body. He deserved an ending that honored that life. Instead, his final chapter is defined by uncertainty, suspicion, and unanswered questions that will likely never be resolved. Maybe that's the real tragedy of Serge Nubret's story. Not just that he died, but that we'll never really know if justice was served, if the truth came out, or if something terrible was allowed to remain hidden. His children maintain their version of events, his friends and fellow bodybuilders have their doubts, and somewhere in between those competing narratives lies a truth that went to the grave with Serge Nubret himself. The mystery remains unsolved, the questions remain unanswered, and the Black Panther's final roar has been reduced to whispers, speculation, and the eternal debate about what really happened when one of bodybuilding's greatest legends fell into a coma he would never escape.